All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works. You send in the sources, and we get down to business, bringing you the key insights. No fluff, just the good stuff. And for this deep dive, it's all about you and a pretty big question in education.
You got it. This time around, you've asked us to really dig into student diversity and how it's represented in research on those social and emotional learning programs you see in schools, you know, SEL. We're diving into a 2018 paper titled Student Diversity, Representation, and Reporting in Universal School-Based Social and Emotional Learning Programs, Implications for Generalizability. It's by Rowe and Trickett.
So SEL programs, they're popping up everywhere, trying to help students build those essential life skills. But this deep dive, we're zeroing in on how diversity fits into the whole evaluation of these programs, right? This article, it kind of highlights a bit of attention, doesn't it? This push for proven evidence-based practices in education, which makes sense, but also the fact that, hey, students aren't all the same. They come from a huge variety of backgrounds and identities.
Absolutely. That's the heart of it.
Hmm.
We're talking about programs designed to be universal, so the big question for you is, do these positive outcomes we keep hearing about, do they really apply equally to all students? Given the wide range of backgrounds and identities we see in schools, right? The authors zeroed in on 5 key aspects of diversity: gender, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or SES disability status, and LGBTQ status.
Makes sense. So how did they even approach this, just unpacking this whole diversity thing?
Well, they started simple, right? First things first. They looked at how often these characteristics were even mentioned in studies on SEL programs.
Like, are researchers even paying attention to who they're studying, basically?
Exactly. They took 117 studies from this big 2011 meta-analysis by Durlak and his colleagues, a really comprehensive look at SEL, and they just started counting. How much are we actually learning about who's included in this data?
Okay, so let's break it down. What do they find? Who's making it into the research spotlight and who's maybe being left in the shadows?
Well, one thing that jumps out right away is the inconsistency. Gender, that was the most frequently reported characteristic, showed up in 69% of the articles. And for the most part, the groups were pretty balanced between boys and girls.
So at least they're paying attention to gender, more or less.
Yeah, but even there, you got to keep in mind, there were some studies where girls made up over 60% of the participants, and then a few cases where the treatment and control groups didn't quite have that same gender balance, which could skew things a bit. So yeah, they're looking at gender, but it's not always a perfect picture.
Got it. So gender's on their radar. What about race and ethnicity? That's got to be a huge factor.
Totally. And they did report it in 64% of the articles, a bit less than gender. But here's where things get really interesting. Over half of those articles we're talking, 56 of them had a single racial or ethnic group making up the majority of the participants.
Starting to see that imbalance creeping in. Which groups were we mainly seeing?
Primarily white students, that was in 34 of those studies, and then black students in 17. So already not a very representative picture.
Yeah, not super encouraging so far. What about, like, representation for other groups? Asian American students, Native American or Alaska Native students, were they even on the map?
Sadly, not so much. Only one study each had a majority of those students. It's a real gap in the research. On the one hand, about 2/3 of the samples did include 3 or more racial groups, so some diversity within the studies themselves.
Okay, so some mixing, but still skewed towards certain groups.
Yeah. And then you had the small group, just 4 samples, that were exclusively one race, no mixing at all. And to make things even more complicated, the reporting wasn't always super detailed. Sometimes a study would mention one group, say white students, but not give you any info on the rest of the makeup of the participants. So if you're trying to understand the big picture, who are these programs actually being tested on, it's not always crystal clear.
Yeah, that makes it hard to know how much we can generalize these findings, right? Like,
Yeah.
if a program works for a mostly white sample, does that automatically mean it'll work for a mostly black sample or a mixed race sample? We just don't know.
Exactly. And that lack of clarity is a real problem if we're trying to build a truly inclusive and equitable education system. Okay, so moving on from race and ethnicity, what about socioeconomic status, SES? How much does a student's economic background factor into this research?
That's a huge factor for sure. Did they even look at that?
They did, but again, not as much as you might hope. It was reported in 45% of the articles, so less than half. And the other tricky part is that how they measured SES varied a lot.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, some studies used free or reduced price lunch eligibility. Made sense, it's a pretty common indicator of economic disadvantage. But others used broader terms like economically disadvantaged, which could mean a lot of different things, right? Some looked at living situations, some at parents' education levels. It was all over the place.
So it's hard to compare. Like, we're not always comparing apples to apples when it comes to SES and its impact.
Right. And most of the time, they were only using one of these indicators, not really taking a more, holistic view of SES.
So not a very complete picture there either. What about disability status? Do they look at how SEL programs might be working differently for students with disabilities?
This is where the numbers really take a nosedive, which is pretty alarming. Disability status was only reported in 15% of the articles, a tiny fraction. And get this, out of those that did report it, over a third, like 35%, specifically excluded students in special education programs.
Wow. So we're not just talking about limited reporting, but actually excluding a whole group of students from the research. That's pretty troubling. What about the studies that did include students with disabilities? What were they looking at?
Well, they used different indicators, things like whether a student was receiving remedial support or if they had an ADHD diagnosis or were identified as learning disabled. So for a significant portion of students, those with disabilities, we just don't have a lot of information about how these programs are impacting them.
Not a great track record. All right, last one, and this is a big one. LGBTQ status. I mean, in today's world, you got to be considering this. Did the researchers look at how these programs might be working differently for LGBTQ students?
Here's the shocker. LGBTQ status was not reported in a single one of those 117 articles, not one. It's a huge blind spot. Really makes you question how universal these programs really are if they're not even looking at this aspect of student diversity.
That's a huge oversight, right? I mean, to have zero data on such a significant part of the student population in this day and age, that's really concerning. So if we step back and look at this whole diversity reporting thing, paint me a picture. What's the overall situation?
Okay, the big picture is, well, it's not great. Over 15% of those articles, they didn't report any demographic characteristics, and another 21% only reported one. Only about a quarter, 24%, reported on gender, race, and SES together. So yeah, a lot of missing info. It's tough to really wrap your head around who's actually being included in these studies and how the programs might be affecting different groups differently. Like we were saying before, it really makes you wonder if this push for evidence-based practice is maybe built on a foundation that's, well, a bit shaky, not really capturing the full diversity of our students.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to build this house of evidence-based education, but we're missing some crucial building blocks.
Right.
Okay, so we have a better sense now of who's being counted or not counted. But the next question, and this is where it gets really interesting, did the program outcomes actually differ for these various groups? Did they do those analyses, those moderation analyses, looking for subgroup differences?
They did, some of them at least. Out of the 117 articles, only 41, about 35% actually did any moderation or subgroup analyses. And that was based on at least one of those 5 characteristics. And within those 41 articles, they did a total of 50 of these moderation tests. That's not even counting some more complex analyses.
And which characteristics got the most attention? Which ones were they most interested in seeing if they made a difference in how the program worked?
Gender, hands down. That was 37 out of 50 tests. Race and ethnicity was a distant second, only 8 tests. Then SES with 2, and disability status with 3, and again, LGBTQ status, nothing.
So they're really focused on gender when it comes to seeing if the program works differently for different groups. Makes sense, I guess, but
Yeah.
still. What do they actually find? Did program outcomes tend to vary based on these characteristics?
Well, out of those 50 tests, 19 showed a significant moderation effect. Meaning, yeah, for those 19, the program seemed to work differently depending on which group you were looking at. For race and ethnicity and SES, the findings were all over the map. You had some significant results, some not significant. And there wasn't a clear pattern, of one racial or ethnic group doing consistently better or worse. Except for one study on SES where they found that students from higher SES backgrounds, they tended to gain more.
Interesting. But also potentially problematic, right? Like, if these programs are actually widening the gap between higher and lower SES students, that's a big red flag.
Right. It raises questions about whether these programs as they are now might actually be making inequality worse, even if unintentionally. Definitely something to think about.
What about a disability status? Any clear findings there?
Those were actually pretty encouraging. All 3 studies that looked at disability status found that students with disabilities actually benefited more on some of the outcomes. which kind of flips the script, right? And it
Right.
suggests that in some cases, these programs, even though they're designed as universal, can actually be really beneficial for a wide range of learners, including those with disabilities.
That's good to hear. It kind of pushes back against the assumption that universal programs might not be the best fit for everyone, or that they might leave certain students behind. All right, last but not least, the big one, gender. Tons of tests, as we saw. What did they reveal?
So gender, yeah, lots of data, but the findings, they were all over the place. A real mixed bag. Out of 37 tests, 22 found no significant difference between boys and girls. But 15 tests did find a significant gender effect, meaning the program worked differently depending on whether you were a boy or a girl. So, no easy answers there.
And any patterns in those 15 tests that did show a difference?
Here's where it gets a little tricky. When the outcomes they were looking at were things like physical violence or aggression, the trend was often that boys benefited, but girls didn't. But then for SEL skills that were more about, interpersonal interactions, the pattern sometimes flipped girls, showing more positive effects. It's not straightforward at all. So yeah, no sweeping statements about how gender influences SEL program outcomes. It really seems to depend on what skills the program's focusing on and what outcomes you're measuring.
Makes sense. Like, a program that emphasizes conflict resolution might have a different impact on boys versus girls than a program that's all about emotional regulation. It's not one size fits all. Didn't they also take a deeper look at gender in violence prevention programs specifically?
They did. They zeroed in on 11 articles that focused on violence prevention. But even within that narrower category, the findings on gender still pretty varied. 6 of those 11 articles found a significant gender effect. So sometimes boys showed stronger effects on, say, behavioral aggression, while one study found girls had stronger effects on cognitive concentration. And then there was this one where the boys in the program actually had lower scores on perceived risk for drug dealing compared to the control group. So yeah, even when you narrow it down to a specific type of SEL program, gender still plays a super complex role. It's just not that simple.
So much for easy answers.
hmm
Okay, this is getting into some pretty nitty-gritty research stuff, but I think it's important. Beyond just reporting whether these moderation analyses were done and what they found, they also looked at the justification for doing them right. Was there a reason based on prior research or a hypothesis they had going in that made them think, hey, we should check if these groups respond differently?
Oh yeah, that's a crucial point. They were checking if the moderation analyses were what they called a priori, meaning was there a solid reason, based on existing research or a specific theory, to expect that different groups might respond differently to the program? And they found that only 20 out of 50 of those moderation tests actually had that kind of upfront justification. Only 3 of those even had a specific hypothesis laid out beforehand.
Interesting. So a lot of them were more like, let's see if there's anything interesting here, rather than having a clear reason to expect a difference.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if they were maybe just kind of fishing for differences. And it turns out that hunch, it was kind of spot on. They found that 75% of the tests that did have that upfront justification, they showed significant moderation. But 76% of the tests without that justification, they found nothing. So yeah, studies were way more likely to find a difference between groups if they actually had a good reason to be looking for it in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're just throwing a bunch of analyses at the data and hoping something sticks, you're bound to find some random fluctuations. But it doesn't necessarily mean those differences are meaningful or reliable.
Exactly. And that makes you think twice about the conclusions being drawn, right? If we're just sort of data mining for differences without a clear rationale, what does that really tell us? Are those findings actually useful? It's a valid question.
So, more reason to be critical consumers of research, especially when it comes to these complex issues of diversity and program effectiveness. Okay, so what about when they did find significant moderation? Did they at least try to explain why the program might have had different effects for different groups in their discussion sections?
Not always. Only 13 out of those 50 moderation analyses had any kind of explanation offered. And the explanations they did give, they fell into 2 main buckets. One was pre-existing differences between the groups. Like they might say, oh, this violence prevention program didn't show much of an effect for girls because they tend to start out with lower levels of aggression anyway. Something like that.
Okay, so kind of accounting for differences that were already there before the program even started. What was the other bucket?
The other bucket was features of the program itself, but this was mentioned less often. Things like, oh, maybe the gender or race of the person running the program matched some of the students, so they connected better, stuff like that.
Yeah, interesting. So even when they found differences, they didn't always dig deep into the why. All right, last piece of the puzzle, and this is where it gets really real for folks out there trying to apply this research. Did they talk about generalizability at all? The idea of whether a program that works in one setting will work in another with different groups of students?
This is where the rubber meets the road, for sure. And they found that only 15 of those 41 articles that did moderation analyses actually talked about generalizability in their discussions. And even then, nobody was making any big, sweeping claims that, hey, this program works for everybody no matter what.
Okay, so at least a little bit of caution there. What kind of statements were they making about generalizability? What should people be paying attention to?
Well, sometimes they use the lack of significant moderation to say, hey, it seems like this program works pretty much the same, regardless of the students' backgrounds. Fair enough. But then some articles that had like mostly white participants or a sample from a very specific area or racial group, they were like, hold on, don't go generalizing this to everybody. It might not work the same way for more diverse populations, which, makes sense. But here's the kicker. None of those statements about generalizability were based on any kind of formal theory. It was more just like gut feeling or common sense.
So they were aware of the diversity issue, but it wasn't always a super rigorously examined part of the research. All right, let's wrap this up. Big picture time. What are the key takeaways from all this? What do we need to remember about diversity in SEL program evaluations?
3 big points. First, diversity characteristics, they're not consistently reported. We're flying a bit blind here. Second, when they do look at those subgroup differences, the moderation analyses, it's not that common, and often it's not backed up by any strong theory. And third, when they do those analyses, the results are all over the place. It really depends on the program, what you're trying to achieve, and who the students are. So it's just not easy to make those big sweeping statements about how well these programs work across all the different types of students we see in schools.
Right, like that finding about students with disabilities benefiting more. That was interesting and unexpected. Shows how much we still don't know.
Totally. And remember that point about the lack of data on LGBTQ plus students? That's a major gap. Makes you really wonder how universal these programs truly are.
Yeah, that's a big one. So basically, the article is saying, hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just because some big meta-analysis says SEL is great overall doesn't mean we can just assume it applies equally to every single student. We need to look closer at the individual studies, at the specific programs and groups involved.
Absolutely. For you, the listener, the takeaway is this. Approach SEL with a critical eye. Not all programs are created equal, and their impact isn't uniform. Context matters.
A lot to chew on.
Sure.
So here's a final thought. Knowing all this, that these programs can work differently for different students, what other questions does this raise for you? What else do we need to explore to figure out what truly works in education for all students? It's a complex picture, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought, especially on how diversity plays into the whole effectiveness of SEL programs.
For sure. It's an ongoing conversation, and the more we dig in, the more we learn.
Thanks for diving in with us. Catch you next time on The Deep Dive.